Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And I am joined today by Stephen Erikson. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
And today, Steve, we're going to go through, how would you describe this scene?
Well, it's a scene that was set up really early on in Deadhouse Gates, I guess at the very beginning with Coltain. But it's kind of holding off on a joke for as long as possible through a novel, and then you deliver the payoff at a certain point. So it's the Sappers and the demotion.
So the scene is, it's the demotion of the sapper captain as a reward.
Yeah.
So we'll go through it as normal. We'll have a chat about it as we're going through, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, hopefully, about aspects of comedy and things like that in literature, because comedy is very hard to do in any form, but particularly I think in literature, because so much about timing. Timing is at the heart of so much comedy, but how do you manufacture timing in the written word when you can't control how fast a reader reads?
Oh, you can manufacture it.
Yeah.
I'll explain how. Don't worry.
Yeah. So that was one of the things that I thought we would chat about. So this is Deadhouse Gates, and I'll put all of the detailed information sort of in the description below.
And I understand some people listen to us at 1.5 or twice the speed, so we should talk really slow, AP.
Either that, or we should talk really quickly.
Yeah.
Because if we talk really quickly, then it's going to sound very strange. We're starting at this section, arriving at the vanguard. One of the aspects here, because there's a scene transition, you again, because you're starting a new scene, you've done that. Arriving at the vanguard, they came upon a scene. So you signal a transition of the movement from, if I just scroll up here, the preceding scene where we had all of this description. So arriving at the vanguard, they came upon a scene. It's just your like a nice shorthand way of signaling to the reader, even though there's not a section break, even though there's not a scene break, that you have now transitioned to a new place. Yeah,
and just talking, I know we talked about transitions before, but this is one of the most direct transitions you could possibly get. Not only that, I'm describing a scene, so it's already evoking a set piece, and that's what we're sort of coming up to. But just in terms of background, when I was, this if memory serves, and it may not in this case, but I have a sense that I did that initial meeting of Coltain, and forgot that there was a captain of the engineers, the Sappers. And so he never showed up in that meeting. And then I think I probably thought later, oh, crap, I forgot this character. Especially since I came up with a name for him that I absolutely adored, Mincer. And then I probably thought about going back and sticking Mincer in there somewhere. But then, for whatever reason, I either forgot or just thought maybe I was introducing too many characters as it was in that scene. I just put that to the wayside, and then proceeded to repeatedly put it to the wayside with every meeting of the command structure all the way through. And at some point, I guess I realized that, oh, I'm setting something up here, and this will be a lot of fun. And so I left him out of everything, and that's what's frustrating, is that was one of my favorite names, but I basically never got to use it. But and that's all leading up to this payoff quite late in the book.
Well, and I think this is an interesting thing about the difference between what a writer does and obviously what a reader gets, because during your writing process, you had made a mistake at a certain point where you'd forgotten to put in a key military person, this captain.
I think so, yes.
And then at a certain point you went, well, actually, now I can actually turn it into a running gag, that they are never there, and I can drop hints about it all the way through. And then you can have a scene that will obviously pay off about this. But for a reader, we don't know that you'd forgotten to include them there.
No.
Because we are assuming that everything in the text is deliberate. And obviously you could have gone back while you were writing and inserted them, and we would never have known about it.
No.
But when we then get to it, we see this as, oh, he very deliberately left him out of this early scene. Whereas you've gone, well, initially it was a mistake, then it became deliberate. And
yeah, and that's one of the things, you know, for when somebody's writing a first draft and you know, you realize that sort of you've left gaps and stuff, you're not automatically required to go and fill those gaps. In other words, some of them are actually opportunities, and you can then weave them into, you can weave that absence into the story that you're creating. And that's one of the ways you can sometimes stumble upon surprising the reader, because in a sense you've already been surprised by having, you know, left that gap, and then leaving it through the writing of the entire story until it's time for it to be delivered and filled. So, you know, a lot of beginning writers overwrite. They write their scenes and they write their stories or their novels over and over and over again, and are constantly tinkering at it. I can't imagine that actually being a productive way of doing it. Maybe some writers can rework things like that, but I certainly couldn't. I would lose the life of the story, would just drain out. Constant repetition, constant rereading of your own stuff. It just takes energy away from things. So sometimes if you know, you forget things and things are left out there, just don't worry about it. It actually might be an opportunity. So,
well, and there's an interesting thing then about the idea that flaws, because leaving something out, we could consider a flaw in the narrative. But there's I believe it is a Japanese tradition where they take like a broken pot and then they fill the crack in with gold, and they turn the flaw into something beautiful that actually enhances the piece. Yeah. We see this actually with wood turning, where if they have cracked a bowl and then they use resin with colors and or inlays, that they turn that flaw, that crack, that problem into an attention point, an accent point that actually adds beauty and color to the piece. So
but I mean that's all for, you know, aesthetic purposes. I think in this case, for me, it is opportunity for comedic effect. Another classic example would be, well, there's two, but one is Nefarious Bread, who is a character that never made it onto any of the lists of the Malazan Marines. And I won't go into any more details on that because that's a spoiler, obviously. Or can we talk spoilers? I don't know. It's too far along in the series.
It's too far ahead of this.
Yeah. Okay.
But
well, Nefarious is certainly one example. The other one would be Verandas, the Jagut, where I made the mistake of switching genders. And then when I'm writing the Carcanis trilogy, I start making fun of the dubious element of Verandas in terms of the point of view from other characters. So, you know, if you're going to make a mistake, just go for the throat. Just go right into it and have fun with it, rather than, you know, get all embarrassed and try to fix it somehow. Because, you know, once the books are published, they're published, and, you know, I'm not going to go back and rewrite things. So, and this is probably one of those instances where, you know, I thought, oh crap, I forgot Mincer. Well, all right, let's you know, create something amusing out of that.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I think people sometimes think that a piece of fiction, a piece of narrative has to be absolutely perfect, but there's no such thing as objectively perfect. It is absolutely unobtainable.
Yeah.
And then when there are mistakes or absences in the narrative, you go, well, okay, that thing hasn't been mentioned. It probably should have been. We talked about this in a previous video about a missing sheath for a weapon. But is it the end of the world? No, it's not the end of the world. It's a very minor thing. A couple of sentences insert could have fixed it, but at the end of the day, should you really have to go back and do that just to fix that one little tiny thing? Sometimes it's important. Sometimes it's just window dressing and irrelevant. But and other times like this, it can lead to you having the opportunity to create a scene for a completely different purpose.
Yeah, and I must have reached that conclusion very quickly. Like I may well have realized that I didn't have Mincer in that opening scene with Coltain, Bolt, and all the rest. I may have realized that writing the following scene. So it would have been very easy to just go back and slip them in there. But I'm very much a linear writer, so I start on page 1 and I end up on the last page. So a part of me does not like to insert text in blocks that I've already written, because to me it puts at risk the sort of internal rhythms and pacing that has already been there, that's already set up the first time around. So I'm always very, very nervous about cutting and pasting of any kind. I think it's because I write more with that full sort of symphonic kind of idea for each scene, so that everything's already sort of rhythmically presenting itself in such a way that it feels dangerous to mess with it once I've got that first draft down. A few word choice changes and things like that, that's not a problem. There's another kind of rhythm that's at work that can really be messed up with cut and paste. It's funny because in workshops, I've seen short stories when revised that are showing cut and paste, and you can tell it's been cut and paste because tone changes, sentence pattern goes wonky, and it's like a paragraph doesn't belong where it's now found in that subsequent draft. So even when I did rewrites in short stories, I didn't pull up the document of the original short story. First of all, we didn't have, we actually couldn't save documents in that fashion back then. But what I would do is I would have the printed copy of the short story beside me, and I would rewrite starting on page 1, first line, and write it all the way through, and that would be my second draft, rather than cutting and pasting and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, so transition, yeah, it's a pretty quick one. Arriving at the Vanguard, they came upon a scene. So it's basically telling the reader that we're setting something up here.
And if you look at the next sentence, well, actually the next 3 sentences, because we have Coltain, Bolt, and Captain Lull were present, and facing them in a ragged line, 10 paces away, were the last of the engineers. So the idea that the engineers are scrappy, there are very few of them left, that they are ragged, but they are lined up in front of the commanders. Because this is coming on the end of a scene and a whole sequence where it has been brutal, it has been dark, it has been very, very violent. The use of ragged and the last of the engineers, and the fact that they are being lined up in front of the commanders, this actually feels very, very ominous just in that paragraph. And you then have, I would have you witness this, historian. And that's, Coltain to Duiker. Like, I would have you witness this, historian. Like, this sounds ominous, formal. Like, the reader, I didn't know what was going to happen. And then you have Duiker replies, what have I missed? Bolt grinned. And that one word, grinned, suddenly changes the tone of this whole section for me.
Yeah, and of course, knowing Bolt's character, we know we're going to get something that's, well, kind of not particularly deferential to the scenario. Guess that's the best way to put it. Yeah.
And we have this nice then that he says, you'd think battles with Camus Relo were tactical nightmares, in reference to the difficulty of getting all of these engineers to actually appear and all be standing together.
Yeah.
And then says the one thing that, I've been thinking as a reader, like here they are looking like they're waiting to be ambushed or worse. And Duiker echoes my thoughts, which are, and are they, Uncle? Like Duiker here is very much tied to, I'm very tied to his perspective. He's echoing my thoughts because this seems suspect. Although Bolt is grinning, and that's changing the tone slightly, I'm still worried about what Coltain is going to do to these engineers.
Yeah, and we've already seen that Bolt can grin at the worst things. So that's his response to things.
Yeah. And then it's not particularly reassuring when the commander's grin broadened. Maybe.
Yeah.
Not reassuring me here, Steve.
Yeah.
And then we have something which is quite unexpected, which is Coltain now stepped toward the assembled soldiers, and Coltain now delivers
his only speech.
The speech. So
yeah, I think it's his only speech like this. Because we've kept Coltain at I have at such a distance that you only ever, you're there to witness his presence, but you never get anything further than that. You don't know his mindset. So he's a cipher, and now he's delivering a formal statement in fairly, arch language. And it's clearly, he puts great import into what he's saying here. So basically, Coltain's being set up as sort of the ultimate straight man, and that's already happening at this point.
And his speech here, symbols of bravery and gestures of recognition can only ring hollow. This I know, yet what else is left to me? 3 clan leaders have come to me, each begging to approach you men and women with an offer of formal adoption to their clan. Perhaps you're unaware of what such unprecedented requests reveal, or perhaps judging by your expressions, you know. I felt the need to answer on your behalf, for I know more of you soldiers than do most Wiccans, including those clan leaders, and they have each humbly withdrawn their requests. And so this speech, I'm looking at it and I'm going, so symbols of bravery and gestures of recognition are only going to ring hollow because of the sacrifice of the Sappers, because of what the Sappers have done. They've acted so bravely. There is nothing that can be given to them that would match their actions. So, that's a really nice opening because I've witnessed this, I've seen what happened, and, it is part of what you feel for them, but you want some recognition.
Mm-hmm.
But you add this very strange thing here that these clan leaders have approached Coltain to say, we want to adopt them into our clan, to honor them, because this would be a great honor for our clan to have these people. And Coltain, without consulting the Sappers, has gone, no. And this again, like this, it's not that it confuses me, but I get that Coltain knows that the Sappers would have refused. But again, it's the separation from Coltain from his soldiers. He didn't even bother telling them until now, after he had refused on their behalf.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, we could read that as very high-handed. Or on the other hand, we can read it as a deep understanding of his soldiers. And
yeah. He definitely has a deep understanding of Malazan Sappers. They are a tribe unto themselves. So, to be invited into another tribe is can be seen as an offensive, actually. And that's sort of how he's reading their expressions at the moment, which of course, again, is a setup, because those expressions are the ones they always wear in front of officers and any command structure. So it's part of the culture of the Sappers, which of course is going to be played on throughout the rest of the scene.
He was silent for a long moment, full stop. Nonetheless, Coltain finally continued. I would have you know they meant to honor you. And what I like about this is we had his speech, then a new paragraph. He was silent for a long moment, full stop. And then dropping down again. So it's this sentence drifting on its own, this moment of silence, even though there isn't a huge amount of space around it, even though it's not like a really long sentence, not even, you don't even stress that this moment stretches for a long time. It feels like an uncomfortable silence has formed because Coltain seems to be expecting some sort of response from the Sappers.
Yeah.
Nothing has come along.
Yeah.
And so nonetheless, Coltain finally continued. So I like how the finally underlines how long and uncomfortable this silence was, and the fact that Coltain basically had been waiting for a response from the Sappers.
And that is that, I mentioned earlier how one can sort of set comedy up through the written word, which is, as you say, it's very difficult because a lot of comedy relates to deflection, distraction, and timing. And so in this case, the fact that the silent for a long moment is his own sentence, is his own paragraph, is altering the timing of the reader as they proceed. So it's the only way to sort of pull that off is how you actually organize your paragraphs, and what you put into paragraphs and what you leave to stand alone, all starts sort of messing with the rhythm that the reader is moving along with. And then of course, using finally continued, sort of like you say, it underscores that the long moment was fairly long, and that Coltain is he had his prepared speech, but now he's off, he's off that track, and it's a little bit, now he's starting to sort of stumble just a little bit.
And what's fascinating about that is Coltain has been entirely self-possessed this entire time. When it comes to tactics, when it comes to what he's doing in terms of managing the soldiers, managing the battle, managing the refugees, he has been in control, absolutely, in front of everyone. And here, when he's trying to sort of talk to the troops, is the time when he's sort of going, right. And it is this wonderful moment of just a little fracture, a flaw, a vulnerability creeping into his character, that we see he has this front with his soldiers. He has his strengths. And public speaking and being this engaging public figure is not one of his strengths.
No, and just to go back to that, imagine if I had written that speech and then he was silent for a long moment comes after, all in one paragraph, because technically it can be, right? You finish with withdrawing the requests, close quotes, he was silent for a long moment. Nonetheless, Coltain finally continued. That can all be one paragraph. But by doing that, you actually, it's hard to explain, but you're not slowing things down when you need to slow it down. And if you want to convey that sense of a character being off put or just sort of stepping wrong, you can do it structurally just by how you place your sentences on the page and how you create your and shape your paragraphs. It sounds weird, but a lot of that is actually very useful for the writer.
Yeah, and that's when I said, like, that's why I emphasized it was a new paragraph, and it's a sentence on its own in a paragraph, because that is the thing that gives you the pause. The structure reflects the separation of time, and it emphasizes it. Whereas if you had done it that way that you just suggested, where they were all run together, you still would have conveyed that Coltain was silent for a moment, but the reader in their head, he was silent for a long moment. Nonetheless, Coltain finally continued. You have shortened the moment that he was silent, whereas he was silent for a long moment. Nonetheless, because of the separation of paragraphs, that long moment extends further, and that's where you get the sense of it becoming uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's crazy, but it actually, after the word moment, full stop, the rest of that line is empty, right? Yeah. And that actually, psychologically, that's part of the silence, is that gap that's sitting there. And for writers, if you have created something that's all in one paragraph, and it sounds or it feels like when you reread it that you've rushed through something that was important, go back and break that paragraph up and see, choose where to break it up. And you'll quickly find that you'll know exactly where to break it up. And that's it's sort of as an exercise in your rewriting and revisions, highly useful. So when I brought up the notion of, conflating all of those lines into one paragraph, that's a great way to test whether something is actually working or not. But to do the reverse as well, to take a long paragraph and break it up and see what happens.
And so moving on to this next section, so you have, nonetheless, I would have you know that they meant to honor you. So what you then follow that with is Duiker's thoughts. Coltain, even you do not understand these soldiers well enough. Those skulls you see arrayed before you certainly look like disapproval, disgust even. But then, when have you ever seen them smile? So this is the thing that, again, I feel this is you extending a helping hand to the reader to navigate this, because there's a lot of implied characterization here. There's a lot of implied information about Coltain. And Duiker is, because we're so tied into his perspective, he's your way of letting me know that this is what's happened. Coltain has waited for a response, hasn't gotten one, and seems to think that the reason he didn't get one is that the soldiers didn't know that they were being honored. That we see this, and we get that through Duiker's perspective, without you having to drop in a paragraph of exposition, without you having to drop in an explanation, that all of this is implied, and then you confirm it with, again, sort of emphasizing it through Duiker, who is guiding us to that without explicitly saying it.
Yeah, and that, in many ways, that's the role of the historian throughout this novel, is to stand to one side and be the bridge for various characters. And he's certainly, the fact that he had been a soldier and that he understands the Marines and the Sappers more so than Coltain does. So he's explaining something to Coltain, but he actually hasn't the guts to say it out loud, and this is certainly not the time to do so. So he's just going to stand there and wait.
So Coltain then sort of moves on to say that he is, there were enough witnesses at the crossing to weave in detail the tapestry of your deeds. That wonderful sort of slightly overblown, I'm talking to the troops. I have had someone write part of this speech for me to give me the turn of phrase to use. And among all of you, including your fallen comrades, the natural leadership of one was noted again and again. Without it, the day would have been truly lost. So this coming from a commander to his troops, recognizing the leadership of one of them, that they were pivotal in saving the day, that they sacrificed so much, and he wants to honor them. Like, this is coming across quite strongly.
Yeah, and of course the whole point about the Sappers is, they're not interested in being noticed. And so that, their expressions get more disapproving at all these accolades, all this attention.
And then this is the beginning of you setting up the joke. So
well, hold on. It's not the beginning, because imagine if I tried to write this from, I don't know, Bungle's point of view, the woman standing beside Mincer. It doesn't work, right? The Sappers need to be as mysterious and as remote as Coltain has been for the reader. You get a sense you know them because you've met people already, like Fiddler and Hedge and stuff. And we've witnessed them in the battles, at least from a distance. So they're both mysterious and remote, and now they're facing off on each other, and that's when sparks are going to fly.
Well, okay, if I rephrase it to, this is the beginning of the punchline.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, but my bad. I used the wrong term. And you're absolutely right. It's not the beginning of the joke. The joke had to start a lot earlier because we needed that mysteriousness about them. So Coltain moved to stand before one man. Duiker recalled him well, a squat, hairless, immeasurably ugly sapper, his eyes thin slashes, his nose a flattened spread of angles and crooks. So even beginning, it's like Coltain is here to honor this noble warrior, this great leader, and you dash that stereotype and smash it to pieces, because heroism is not about the good-looking, handsome Hollywood A-lister who's standing there with their flowing locks and their piercing eyes and their square jaw. Heroism is about the act, and that act can be performed by anyone. So I particularly like that.
Yeah, I mean, immeasurably ugly, of course, is don't forget, we're watching Coltain do this, but it's all Duiker's point of view. So that's kind of once removed. So we don't know what Coltain's thinking about this incredibly ugly sapper standing in front of him. But we get what Duiker's thinking in terms of descriptive. So
and Duiker, as a historian, is not sparing on the details here.
No,
he's very specific. And so I like that. You could look at this and say, oh, this is overdone because there's far too many descriptions and you're overwriting it. And yet, in order to get that impact, I think this listing all of these qualities to go, he's not just ugly, he's really ugly. And here's why he's really ugly, that it keeps going to build this up.
Yeah, and it's one of those interesting details that if you use sparingly, I think it works quite well, but a flattened nose, like a spread of angles and crooks, implies a nose that has been broken many times, which further implies that somebody's punched him in the face enough times to have broken his nose. So this is a fairly obstinate, belligerent, stubborn person who probably has, done things to earn that punch in the nose. So that's all kind of connotatively present there in that description.
Well,
as opposed to his nose, an arch aquiline, whatever. That doesn't work, if you see what I mean.
I know, but you have his eyes thin slashes. And what's interesting about this is we're very used to when someone looks at and they narrowed their eyes. That, that's a very stereotypical thing. But here, the thin slashes, you're doing the same thing of that, not squinting at someone, but the intense furrowing of the brow and the eyes narrowing. Like that comes across that it's not an attractive look.
No. And it may be his natural look. It may be his resting face. We don't know.
Resting sapper face.
Yeah. Somebody will have to draw that.
And then you have, audaciously, he wore fragments of armor that Duiker recognized as taken from a commander of the apocalypse. So he's not even in proper uniform. He's nicked bits of armor from a commander on the other side because he goes, that's good armor, I'll have that.
Yep. Yeah, suggesting also he probably killed that commander. So
yeah, well, it's the only opportunity he would have had to get the armor would have been after he'd shanked the guy.
yep, pretty much.
And so again, it's the subtle emphasis of heroic deeds or these great deeds in battle, but done in a very communicated in a very backhanded way.
Well, and you know, in many ways, if you're going to set up a joke, you need to sort of go full on description of everything that's, you know, the entire setting of that joke, which obviously in this case is all centered on characters. So we need to get as much of those characters laid out there in front of us as we can. And then he's got a helm tied to his belt that could have come from an antique shop in Darujistan. And that's probably me just having, you know, having a bit of fun there. I have no idea why he's got, you know, a helm tied to his belt that is an antique from Darujistan, which isn't, you know, not in the same continent.
But you get an idea that he has a patchwork of oddities that he has picked up over the years. This is a veteran. This is someone who has never held to the, you know, you're not in uniform. And he's like, yeah, what of it? This is better than the uniform that I had. And oh, hang on, this bit's actually quite good. That over the years, he's accumulated stuff. And it gives you a sense of him being a veteran. It gives you a sense of his history, where he would have traveled. Because how did he get a helm from Darujistan? It's implying, at least to me, that he was a veteran in one of the campaigns over there or had visited there. It's just a nice thing. But another object that hung from his belt was difficult to identify. And it was a moment before the historian realized he was looking at the battered remnant of a shield. Two reinforced grips behind a mangled plate-sized flap of bronze.
Yeah.
That is one of the least attractive descriptions of a shield I have ever read.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
So everything about this character is ramshackle, dilapidated, thrown together, but there's an underlying competency to it, that everything here is functional. It's, yes, he has armor from all over the place, but it's armor. He has a helm, he has a shield, and it mightn't look great, but the grips are reinforced. There are elements and qualities to all of these things that belie their outward appearance. And then
it's funny. I mean, the inspiration for this description is probably, you know, Gustav Hasford in his Vietnam novels, and Tim O'Brien and people like that, because the Marines were very much into, you know, readorning themselves in the Vietnam War, and sort of asserting a kind of individuality that, you know, is supposedly drilled out of them in boot camp, but was certainly present there. And I think that's probably evoking some elements, or is rather inspired by that kind of fiction, I think.
So we're used to, in fantasy, when a character gets introduced, when a hero gets introduced, that they look like a hero, and you've already undercut that with the physical description. And then we get those paragraphs of how they were dressed with their billowing cloak and their the chest plate that has the gilded inlay or the silver filigree, and then the beautiful scabbard with whatever sword. And here you're doing exactly the same thing, except it's almost like the opposite. This guy does not look like a hero. This guy does not have the accoutrement of a fantasy hero. He is the antithesis of the expected fantasy hero. It is a subversion of all of that. And yet, in some ways, it is far more realistic of what a competent veteran who is in the thick of it would be like. And so, even though this is you having fun, even though this is you being playful and doing all of these different things, it actually creates, at least for me, an incredible sense of verisimilitude, of mimesis of creating this sense that this world is real, because this is a real soldier who does heroic things. He's not the one posing for the photographs at the end. He's the one out there in the middle of the worst of it. And that takes its toll. And so that's one of the reasons why this description, although I know you're using it for a different purpose, it's one of those things about this description that I actually quite enjoy. It's a subversion of trope. It consolidates and reinforces this idea that this is a real world. And it reminds us that heroes are about what they do, not that they stand and look heroic, despite what Hollywood movies are all about these days, which is everyone looks the part. It's not about looking the part when you're actually doing it. It's about being able to do the part.
And so then Coltain promotes him.
And that's, well, before we get there, it's he also has a blackened crossbow hung from one soldier shoulder, so covered and entwined with twigs, branches, and other camouflage as to make it seem the man carried a bush. And that's where the exaggeration starts to have this comic element. And then you have, I believe the time has come, Coltain said, for a promotion. You are now a sergeant, soldier.
Yeah.
The man said nothing, his eyes narrowing to the thinnest of slits.
Yeah, and you know, any response at this point from Mincer would have been wrong, right? In terms of that comedic thing, you want one side to be delivering sort of all the necessary information, and the other side simply absorbs it, and you're going to hold off on any response from that other side as long as you possibly can, because that just sort of, it keeps people off balance longer. And you want the characters, some of the characters, to be off balance in the scene, but you want the reader to be off balance as well.
So then I think a salute would be appropriate. Bolt growled. So you can see, like, Coltain has said, I've now promoted you to sergeant, and this guy hasn't saluted, hasn't said thank you, hasn't acknowledged it. So Bolt, stepping in as the enforcer, is soldier, your commander has just promoted you. Let's move this. Let's show some respect. And this is when we get the note that Coltain and Bolt have made a bit of a mistake here.
Yeah.
Because one of the other sappers cleared his throat and nervously yanked at his mustache. So now, with the commander engaged and the second in command engaged, it falls on the next person in the chain of command, Captain Lull, to find out what this interruption is. So you're now...
Yeah, and you see what's sort of happening here is that it goes from, okay, Duker's watching, so he's just standing back as the historian, but we brought two characters together. We brought Coltain to Mincer, and the efforts on Coltain's part seem to have failed. They sunk into this deep well of that is Mincer at this point. And so if you're going to build up for that moment, you can't just leave it with these two characters. You got to pull everybody else in. So I pulled Bolt in to reinforce and back up Coltain, because that's his job. Then Captain Lull does a soldierly thing and turns on, you know, the other sapper who's cleared his throat and stepped into this whole exchange. And so it's like building, sort of drawing more elements into this one moment. And of course, the silent island in the middle of all this is Mincer, so, which is how it works, I guess, in terms of laying out the humor.
So Captain Lull rounded on the man. Got something to say about this, soldier? So again, like, Lull is coming in on the side of Coltain and Bolt, but because they're engaged with Mincer, they can't turn their attention away, because that would be sort of like losing the staring contest. They can't look away first.
Yeah, it keeps ratcheting up, right?
So Lull, as the next in command, turns to this other guy going, oh, what are you? Why did you clear your throat? Basically, what's going on? And the sapper going, not much.
Not
The
much.
man muttered. He doesn't want to get involved, but
No.
knows a mistake has been made. And how are you meant to tell the commander of your army that he's just made a mistake? Out with it. The soldier shrugged. Well, only he was a captain not 2 minutes ago, sir. The fist just demoted him. That's Captain Mincer, sir. Commands the engineers. Or did.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, you know, a whole novel almost to set this up. But that's one of the things that I guess always drove me in writing novels is I know I'm setting things up, and the reward for me is the payoff, and when you finally get to it.
But when you had that moment earlier on where you realized that you'd left this out, it's not that you had this exact exchange in mind. You had the opportunity to do something with that absence. And getting to this point, you go, oh, because this was a very dark scene, a very poignant scene, there were a lot of heavy emotions. It would be nice to end on a note of comedy to balance the tone. And so it's just, I don't want people to think that as soon as you realize you went, oh yes, in 10 chapters time, I'm going to insert this joke.
Well, you know what? I probably knew when I was going to insert it because I knew it was going to have to be after the crossing. Because that was the last major set piece before the run starts. Mm-hmm. So it had to happen here. I couldn't wait any longer. So this was the longest I could wait before delivering it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they don't really get the opportunity after this.
And then we have, and this is when, this is when we get, it was Captain Mincer. This is when we get his name. And
yeah.
And then he's now going to be replaced by his sergeant, who's called Bungle.
Bungle, yeah. Yeah.
But
I mean, I think what makes it work for me at least is when Mincer finally speaks, he doesn't say something along the lines of, so I guess you're going to make me captain again, right? No, he accepts the demotion completely. And in fact, he actually embraces it because it's a bit of a relief for him, obviously.
But I love the fact that now that he's been busted down to sergeant, and he's now going to install a new captain, so he just selected. He grabs the woman beside him by the ear and drags her over. And this used to be my sergeant, name's Bungle. And
which sort of, just by grabbing by the ear, you get a sense of how Mincer commanded the sappers, right? Because that's the only way to actually, command the sappers. Yeah.
And then we have that, now we get Coltain's reaction to this. Because if we think about it from Coltain's perspective, before we go into this, he's gone up. He's delivered this speech saying that, all of these people have tried to honor you, and I knew you would view that as a dishonor. So I'm going to promote one of you, and you were so heroic. I'm going to promote you to sergeant. And it turns out that was the captain. He's actually demoted him. What is Coltain meant to do with this entire situation that he has ballsed up?
Yeah, and this is one of the moments I know I probably would have got to sort of names Bungle and then sat back and waited to sort of think, well, given how Coltain has been set up throughout this thing, I cannot have him, for example, laugh out loud, right? It doesn't fit with Coltain and the role that he has established himself throughout the novel. And so I probably was thinking long and hard, and how is Coltain going to respond to this? And then just sort of felt my way through it.
Yeah, because what you have, Coltain spins round so the sappers can't see him.
Yes.
And basically, it just is he's trying to keep it all in his face. But we've all had that situation where you're trying to hide your laughter, so you've turned away, and the shoulders start going. and you're trying not to let people see that you're laughing. Coltain's obviously, much more controlled than that. His shoulders don't start shaking with laughter, but he can't keep it off his face, and he's hiding it from the men. Except Duiker is standing there behind him, so can see directly as Coltain is turned around.
Yeah. Also, I'm pretty sure I was very deliberate in using comic pleasure as opposed to amusement, because for me, I could see Coltain drawing great pleasure out of the absurdity of what has just happened. You know what I mean? It's different from being amused.
Yeah, well, it's not that, and I suppose it goes, he's enjoying the moment with the soldiers rather than laughing at the soldiers.
Yeah.
So I think that comes across more with comic pleasure than if you'd used amusement, because then there's the ambiguity. Is he amused at them or is he amused with them?
Yeah, Coltain's, stared a moment longer. I wanted to talk a little bit about psychic distance, because we've got 3 characters are laid out in this one paragraph, Coltain, Duiker, and Lull. And there's a deliberate, or rather the usage of, do I use the fist? Do I use Coltain? Do I use the historian? Do I use Duiker? And Lull or captain? And you'll see that all of them are used in that one paragraph, but they're all used in the same order. And that is from the personal to the technical, if you will, the personal to the rank or the role that they play. And so it's a case of keeping that consistent. If you're going to have to use that many sort of references to the characters within a paragraph, that you set up a particular order and then you maintain it throughout the paragraph. So it starts out with Coltain as opposed to the fist stared a moment longer. So if I'd done the fist stared a moment longer, then swung around and met the historian's eyes with such comic pleasure that Duiker's exhaustion was simply swept away, flash burned into oblivion. Coltain struggled to keep a straight face, and what would I do there? Duiker bit his lip in his own effort. His gaze caught on Lull. It would have to stay that way, whose face showed the same struggle, even as the captain winked. But that would actually sort of, it wouldn't work as a paragraph for me. That I need to be consistent when I'm setting up the order in which I'm going to describe characters. And because we've just had this exchange that we've seen Coltain's expression, it's no longer sort of the fist's expression, it's Coltain, the human being, Coltain, the person. So it's got to start with Coltain. And then I can default back to, rather than repeating Coltain, 3 times in the paragraph, I can use the title at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because for me, it's when he was to, let's see if I can scroll back up here. Because the fists just demoted him.
Yeah.
And we then get to this section. So the sapper's been referring to their commander, the fist. And because the scene is absurd, and because it is about this human emotion, we see, that's why I liked you using Coltain stared a moment longer, because it's not the fist laughing. It's not, it's Coltain, the man behind the title, the man behind the role. That this is a moment that has cracked that facade. It's gotten inside, and we're seeing Coltain's inner workings.
Yeah.
And that's why I think not only is it a comedic scene, but it's an emotive scene, because this is the catharsis for all of this. This is the release of emotion. And you signal that with sleight of hand, which obviously is a reference back to the conversation between Lull and Duiker. But, about how do you deal with it? Like, you fake it till you make it, or you wait for these moments that allow you that release. And here we have it. And this is a human moment the great fist in a military capacity has just made a massive screw up, and the fist can't admit that. But the man behind the fist, the man who is the fist, he can enjoy the fact that, oh God, this has all just gone to hell.
Right. And so if you look at it, Coltain is, he meets Duiker's eyes with such comic pleasure. And then, but it's the role of the fist who struggles to keep a straight face, right?
Yeah.
If it were the other way around, it wouldn't work as well.
That element of creating a pattern, not that you have to adhere to it rigidly, because obviously you go Coltain, Duiker, historian, fist, Duiker, lull, captain. You know, so you don't go Duiker, you know, because of that, there's this sort of the fist, and then you go back to Duiker instead of repeating historian, that you've sort of cycled back. It doesn't have to be consistent, but it gives the creation of a pattern. And each time it's referring to the person having the human connection, and then referring to their role. So even as the captain winked and mouthed 3 words. So it's the lull, the person is greatly enjoying this, but the captain has to be more reserved.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's a really nice play using the signifiers, the pronouns, to give this additional aspect. And again, it goes to characterization and it goes to storytelling.
Well, definitely characterization, where the psychic distance is, it's closing and pulling back, closing and pulling back, as appropriate to the context of the sentence and the content of the sentence. And I guess it's just, you get practiced at it. Because I don't know how, you know, although I suspect I was fairly conscious of, since I was going to be using 3 characters in 1 paragraph and have a lot going on in there. All 3 characters are having emotional responses. And then they're struggling with those emotional responses with respect to their titles and their official ranks. And so there's a lot going on in that paragraph. So no, I was probably pretty freaking careful in terms of how I set up that paragraph.
Yeah, and I think learning a technique, being aware of something like this, that you write it and you might sort of automatically fall into the pattern of, this is how I'm going to do it. And then you can go back through and double check that you've done it right. You know, it's, I think people sometimes think that you sit and you look at one word and go, is this the right word? And then on to the next one. It's, you write it, but because like any sort of skill or any sort of thing that you do, if you practice often enough, it becomes second nature to work those things in. It's exactly the same with reading, that the more practiced you get at reading, the better you get at reading. The more you practice at editing and analyzing text, the better you get at it. That you're juggling. People think that you're juggling all of these different things. You go, no, they're all in the back of your head when you read. And it's things just pop out on the page as you're going through. You're not consciously thinking about it anymore. You just, you know, your brain knows what to look for as your eyes are going down.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, and to trust in the reader, in the sense that with that paragraph, we know that the Coltain is the fist, and we know Duiker is his historian, and Lull is the captain, right? Those are all well established by now, and so that frees you up to rely on the reader to get what's going on here.
Yeah, and that's if we think, if this had happened much earlier on in the book, before we were confident in who all these characters were, you would have had to write it very differently.
Very differently, yeah.
And that's, again, this comes down to, on a micro scale, obviously we can talk about it in terms of, in a chapter, in a paragraph like this, where it occurs in a chapter, where that chapter occurs in a book, where that book occurs in a series. It scales up and down, that things that are established early on, you can refer to or assume reader knowledge and competency with later. So it's, you can take a paragraph out of context and go, look at this paragraph, isn't this all absolutely terrible? But when you put it back in context and you go, yeah, there were 100,000 words before this that set that up, suddenly that paragraph isn't terrible anymore. Looking at it in context is always an important aspect. One of the reasons I like doing prologue analysis is because it occurs before the context. So it doesn't give stuff away to the reader, but also it's not conditional a lot of the time on knowledge that you're going to get in the book. Whereas a lot of this kind of analysis is very much conditional on having read all of those chapters preceding it.
Yeah, and knowing the characters for sure. And then, after Sleight of Hand, you've got, again, this is so tightly into Duiker's point of view. It's not a narrator, actually. It's the question remained is in Duiker's mind, right? How Coltain would now play it. So.
And again, so you go, how Coltain would play it, composing his face into stern regard. The fist turned about again. So Coltain, the man, has resumed the mantle of the commander, the fist, and he has turned round and going, right, let's make the best of this situation, shall we?
Yeah, and what he does is he just eyes them. He eyes Mincer and Bungle, right? So he's not giving anything away, but he's going, who the fuck are these people? It's like, so yeah.
And what we have here is he could admit, now he has the choice now, admit that he made a mistake, or you know what, let's
run with it. Yeah, he's going to run with it. Yeah.
Which it's a wonderful moment because it conveys a couple of little things. Number one, Coltain has a sense of humor that we were unaware of, basically.
All the way up. Yeah.
The second thing I think it conveys is he does understand his soldiers, and he knows it doesn't matter who the captain is. This core group, they will run themselves as a unit. They don't need his interference. They never got involved in all of that stuff anyway. They organize themselves. Trust your own soldiers. And that's what we've seen from Coltain throughout. He trusts the people under his command.
Yeah. And the question's up is whether Mincer has any sense of humor at all. Right? So, yeah, because he's just this immovable object here. And, I have great regret, for his ultimate fate, because he became a favorite character from this scene onwards.
But it's interesting you raise the fact about Mincer's sense of humor, because you then immediately show that Mincer does have a sense of humor, because Coltain has said that that will be fine, Sergeant. Captain Bungle, I would advise you to listen to your sergeant in all matters. Understood? So Coltain's kind of doing the, okay, we're just going to go with the fact that I've demoted the captain as a reward. Yeah. You've been promoted, but listen to the sergeant because he is still kind of your captain.
But also, I mean, the absurdity of a character named Captain Bungle. It's just, yeah, she's earned her name. Yes.
But the woman shook her head.
Yeah.
She's disagreeing. She's going, I'm not listening to him. And Mincer then says, she's no experience with that fist. I never asked her advice, I'm afraid. So I take this as Mincer having a sense of humor, going, no, she's not going to listen to me. I never listened to her. The comedy keeps building in this, that this is just a disaster. Yeah. And we then get Coltain, I think, almost surrenders to this now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because we have, from what I have
he asked the question that's been hanging over all of this since the very beginning, right? Why did Mincer never show up to any of these meetings? Yeah.
And of course, Mincer's answer is
a shrug.
the internet.
Yep.
and then Bungle, Captain Bungle.
Yeah.
Captain Bungle says, well, the reason was beauty sleep, sir. That's what he always said. And then Bolt mutters the thing that the reader is now thinking, because we know how ugly he is. Who knows the man needs it?
Yeah.
And then you have that understated response from Coltain. Coltain raised an eyebrow. He's now back in control, and it seems intrigued by this whole mess. That it's gotten away from him, and he's just said, "Well, okay, let's see where this goes."
Yeah.
And
the question's out there that Captain Bungle is not quite the sharpest knife in the box, right? So, in the drawer. So, because you don't know whether she's just straight facing it or not. Right?
Well, to be honest, I always assume, because of these novels, that the sappers might appear stupid, might appear silly, but actually they are all pretty smart, if slightly crazy, but they're all pretty smart, canny individuals. So I always get the sense that they're just slightly irreverent towards authority.
Slightly, yes.
And then he sleeps when we march too, sir. Sleeps while walking. I've never seen the like. Snoring away, sir. One foot in front of the other. A bag full of rocks on his back. It's like you've doubled down and then tripled down on the absurdity of the entire thing.
Well, if you think a bag of rocks on his back and a crossbow that's turned into a bush, yeah, it's a pretty comic scene, isn't it? But it invites the reader to imagine it as opposed to us seeing it, right?
Yeah. And then it's, of course, the obvious question is, rocks? Like, what is wrong with you people? So we have Coltain actually say, rocks. And for when he breaks his sword, sir, he throws them, and there ain't a damn thing he can't hit. And then Mincer corrects this. Wrong. Mincer growled, that lapdog.
That lapdog, yeah.
So, like, as much as this is all about this comedy, you keep connecting parts of it back.
Oh shit! You froze up. Go ahead. You're back.
As much as this is all about this comedic scene, this absurdist scene, each time you make these little moments, these little references back to previous things in the narrative. So the sleight of hand reference, and now, well, he missed throwing a rock at the lapdog. So it creates this consistency and continuity, that this is not a scene out of place. This is a scene worked into the entire narrative, because there are these little tiny moments that reference back. And then with Bolt seemed to choke, then spat in sympathy, because then we recall how Bolt had remarked about the lapdog, and we realize that everyone knows about this dog.
And of course, it's setting up the lapdog to be unkillable, which, as it turns out, it's quite true.
And yeah, it creates that link that this becomes the dog that is a symbol then running through all of these things, a little icon connecting all the way through the text.
And the thing is, once you sort of start in writing what, the mindset just is, okay, we're falling right into a comedic scene. They just start tripping. They just, one after the other, just starts coming up. So I'm probably inventing on the fly at this point. And, the rocks and the lapdog, that's probably, first draft stuff. I wasn't setting any of that up. But once that mindset is running with the comedy, I guess instinctively, I just keep pushing it.
Yeah, and obviously then when you look back over it, sometimes you go, okay, I might have gone slightly too far.
Oh, yeah.
You can excise something out.
Where were we?
Coltain had drawn his hands behind him.
Oh, yeah. So again, he's taken it so far that, he's trying to maintain his comportment at all costs. but that's the only sort of physical indication of it, because again, you tie in so closely to the points of view of a character that Duker cannot see. He's already, Coltain's turned around, so all he can see is the back. And I want that because I want Duker to be able to see that grip, that white knuckled grip, right? Because he couldn't have seen it if he was facing him, but you'd be looking at his Coltain's expression, and we don't want that at this point, right? Because we just want the figure there, under control, as it were, or attempting to remain under control.
And this is one of those interesting things about using like a close third person focalization, where the person is standing and what they can actually see. If you relax that slightly, because you could have put in, something about Coltain's features, but that actually would have been a mistake because of the perspective, because we know Duker is standing behind him, Coltain is facing away. So it invites the question, how did Duker see his face?
Exactly.
Now, if you'd used a different narrative technique, if you'd use an omniscient or semi-omniscient perspective, a floating camera, you can have the camera pan round and show Coltain from different angles. But because so much of this is focalized on Duker and we're dipping in and out of his head, but we are locked into his perspective, that's where you've decided to put it. And you're being consistent, and that limits your view of things.
Yeah, but to one's own advantage. That's the point, right? You don't view it as a limitation. You view it as a perspective, and that perspective allows you to actually manipulate what's being seen in a scene and among characters and all the rest. If I had done that roving camera, then you've got a narrator of some form who is now no longer invisible, but is actually, physically moving about the scene. And of course, there's been no precedent of that set up anywhere in the entire series. So,
well, Toll the Hounds.
No, I would disagree on that.
We can talk about that when we get to Toll the Hounds.
Yeah.
Because and again, it's to do the idea of narrator and narration is actually a lot more complex than sometimes we talk about. We use a shorthand for a lot of it instead of talking about the complexity of it. But when I said limitation, what I meant was you have limited the field of vision, and because of those borders, you get to choose very specifically within that. So it allows you to focus on what you're telling. If you have a roving, free-ranging camera, then you have no limits about what you can show. So that is very freeing, but at the same time, sometimes writing to a constraint forces you to be more creative, forces you to be more detailed.
Always.
Whereas if you can do absolutely anything, then it becomes harder to create a specific tone with it or a specific style, because you can constantly pick and choose absolutely anything. But limiting it to a field of vision allows you to have something like the white knuckled grip, because with that is something that Duker can see. That is something you have decided to show us. It communicates Coltain's desperate need not to break and laugh in front of his soldiers. But it does it in a way that is subtle. And again, Coltain is hiding that from the soldiers, and just Duker can see it. So you're communicating all of that because of perspective, because of what you've chosen to show. And even white knuckled, the idea of a white knuckled grip could have been anger. And we frequently see that when someone's knuckles tighten into a fist, that's how it's described. But here we can see it's all about maintaining control and not laugh out loud.
Yeah. And the next line, of course, reinforces Coltain's hyper-awareness of where everybody is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it almost implies that 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 hyper awareness is almost supernatural in the sense that he can sense that Duiker is staring at him right now, and can see what is to be seen. Yeah.
And you have that. We've got Coltain. His speech has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter, because obviously in trying to maintain control, short sentences don't, because the longer he talks, the harder it's going to be to hide that he wants to laugh. So, historian, you will record this. And Duiker not paying him any favors here by saying, "Oh, aye, sir, every blessed word." Because Duiker's enjoying himself. He's not a military officer. And so then we have the engineers get dismissed.
Yeah. But one last bit right there with the dismissal. Right? One man clapped Mincer on the shoulder. Yeah.
And received a blistering glare in return. One dysfunctional group of soldiers.
Yep.
Now, here you have your spirits below, Bolt hissed. Why hissed?
He's keeping it, he doesn't want the sappers to overhear him.
So it's that kind of low volume, keeping your lips quite tight together to say something like, pursing your lips while you're talking to control it. So how do you describe that if you're not going to use hissed? So you could say whispered, but that has a different connotation.
Yeah. No, I just settled on hissed.
So it's Duiker smiled. "Your soldiers, Commander." "Aye," he said, suddenly beaming with pride. "Aye." And we get that Bolt looks on these soldiers and is impressed by them. Not only their heroics, but this is the kind of real soldier that he likes.
Oh, absolutely.
And here we have this wonderful moment from Coltain where he says, "I did not know what to do." Coltain confessed. And I like this because, again, we've talked about how that chink in the armor occurred, that little cracking to see the man behind the legend that was forming. And this is this moment where he's turned to his command group, the most trusted people he has, and he's like, "Guys, that was absolutely absurd. I did not know what to do when it all went to shit." And this is, I think, the last moment that Coltain has to be human.
Yeah, it is.
And so
maybe, well, even when he talks to Duiker and gives him the out, he's pretty formal there too, isn't he?
Yeah. Because he is conferring a set of sort of orders on Duiker about getting the refugees to Aran.
Yeah.
And while we see behind the mask, this is a moment where the mask has been absolutely removed, and we see Coltain as a man. And I think this is the moment where, while we have, as readers, been going through and seeing him as this warrior, this general, starting from our perception of him as the barbarian tribal war leader, to seeing him as a competent commander, to seeing him as a great general and tactician, this legend being built step by step along the way. This is one of those moments that we are reminded that he is a human character. He isn't just that role of the fist. He isn't just the commander of the chain of dogs.
But also that the legend that's being built will not survive beyond the army itself, right? This is the legend that actually allows Coltain to lead his troops as far as he's able to do so. It's an internal. It belongs to the army here, and because the notion of, if you think of, say, Alexander, it was the legend that he promulgated within the ranks of his soldiers that allowed him to do and conquer all that he did. And yeah, it also, there is an effect where, he shatters Darius's armies and all the rest because he is Alexander. But without those soldiers following him all the way to, the Indus Valley, none of that would have happened. So the legend actually has to be created within the ranks and among the ranks. And this is kind of what is being referred to here. That this is, the story's already making its way. It's doing its rounds already. And, return him to the ranks. I mean, yeah, it's an odd way of doing it, but the fact that does lift them all up. So,
and that was one of those moments that, yeah, if the captain is now a sergeant, it means that every sergeant is now basically a captain. It was the other way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And after being through so much, that suffering so badly, the fatalities and casualties that they've had, that core group that's left is going to be incredibly tightly bound.
Yeah.
And this is, they see it as a way of binding them even closer together. They are all the same. And it creates that camaraderie. So when you talk about the formation of the bridge burners and that story, the formation of any legendary company, it's moments like this that you imagine are at the core of where that initial thing came from. The blood and suffering and turmoil, and those survivors left over at the end of something that was probably absolutely horrendous, but that they're the ones that carry that legend on.
Yeah.
And that's where the legend builds up and forms around. So this is one of those moments that, because if we want to talk about meta narrative, the idea of Coltain and the mythology of the chain of dogs, why it has such resonance, and why then, ensuring that the historian Duiker has noted this scene. Because Coltain could quite easily have said, Duiker, do not under any circumstance tell anyone about this, because this was a massive mistake. This makes me look bad. I'm embarrassed. But Coltain, his direction to Duiker, the historian, did you record this? This must be recorded because this is who we are. And that, I thought, was a very nice note. And it goes to that metatextual comment about the formation of legend. It goes to an element of the character of Coltain. And it plays into like all of these things that we engage with and why we have connection to certain characters, I think. Just to close it all out, it's, you have a captain named Bungle now, nephew, Bolt said. Think she'll be there in polish and shine next briefing? And Lull, and this is rare for Lull. Lull chips in without being addressed and speaks to his higher ups, saying, not a chance. She's probably packing her gear right now. And Coltain shook his head. They win, he said, in evident wonder. I am defeated. And that is one of those moments that obviously when you finish the book has different resonance.
Yeah.
But right here you go, of all of the things that Coltain could talk about in terms of defeat, like everything that he has achieved on this chain of dogs, on this trek with all of these burdens. And it's the antics of the sappers are the things that have absolutely just beaten him, and he had no way of fighting back or defending himself.
Yeah.
So,
you know, if you're gonna, yeah, if you're gonna deliver those kinds of sort of comedic moments that actually have, you know, important elements in them, then you need that denouement to close out the scene for sure.
But no, one of the reasons I like that scene, not only is it a brilliant comedic scene, I laughed when reading it, but because it follows that very poignant, heavy, we'd gone through the violence and the death, and that whole section, we'd gone through the aftermath of that, where it's emotionally draining. And then we end on that moment of absurd comedy. That we have these moments of absurd humor and laughter as a release for grief, as a release for trauma. And it's very rare to see that reflected in fantasy fiction. We're used to seeing the soldiers, you know, as they're killing people with their deadpan quips, and we see that in action movies all the time. But the idea of the humor following genuine pathos and emotion as a cathartic release, that's slightly different.
Well, not only cathartic, but also binding. So the idea that this little, you know, interlude, this little scene, then becomes legendary within the army, is also serving to, you know, further allow that force that has just gone through a horrendous battle and taken terrible losses. So in other words, it's not just cathartic for the characters in the scene, but it becomes this thing that ripples outwards throughout the entire army as a cathartic event. So it would have been different if, you know, if Lulad said, "Oh, they're not going to tell anybody about this." That would have that would be wrong, right? It has to, in order to mean something more, it has to move out beyond the immediacy of that scene. And then as the writer, you need to bear that in mind, that, you know, this is now part of the fabric of what's holding the army together.
Well, and also, I can't imagine any unit where something like this happened and it wasn't immediately the scuttlebutt that went faster than you would have thought humanly possible.
Yeah.
Someone on an outlying picket would go, "Oh, did you hear about what Coltain did today?" Because that is the sort of story that spreads like wildfire, and everyone has a laugh and everyone enjoys it. And they're not laughing at Coltain. It's the enjoyment of that moment of, with everything going on, this was just funny.
And, you know, that's one of the ways in which, you know, comedy can actually deepen the emotional contact that the reader has, I think, with the story, because it allows the reader that moment of catharsis as well, just a bit of a relief of the pressure. And I always knew that, you know, Deadhouse Gates is a relentless book, and the Chain of Dogs is a pretty oppressive tale. So it needed these moments, but in some ways, you know, I could have interspersed them throughout the Chain of Dogs, and many readers may well have said, you know, may well have liked that, actually preferred, so it didn't feel as much of a slog. But then the characters are going through a slog, so, you know, in that sense, it needs to be as burdensome to the reader in some ways as it is for the characters. I mean, obviously once removed, but, and so there's always this tightrope, at least in my mind, to, you know, I want, it's almost as if the characters are suffering, I want that, you know, a little flavor of that suffering to slip into the reader in some fashion or another. but only because I want them to feel whatever they're going to feel when you come to the end of something, and there's a payoff in one form or another, or a tragic result as well.
And again, it comes down to this, that, well, there were 2 points I wanted to raise here, but one about contrast and atonal stuff. So remind me about contrast and atonal. But when you talk about the Chain of Dogs was unrelenting, if you and it is obviously a very valid technique that you could have had a powerful scene followed by a scene to relieve the reader of that, either a moment of humor or a lighthearted moment or something fun, something different, just to ease the burden off on the reader. And some readers would really enjoy that. You're absolutely right. But some readers would go, but I was enjoying the build-up of that feeling, the build-up of that momentum. So it's always going to be a choice between how much do you increase and add weight to that specific tone, building that tension up, and then when you release it. That is an artistic choice. Some readers will go, that scene was so much better because there had been so much build up to it that when that release happens, that scene is actually a lot funnier and a lot more of a release.
Yeah, and that's sort of that's where I lean towards is. But what it does is it put all that much more pressure on actually succeeding with that scene than if I'd had a whole bunch of smaller scenes. And so, but I like that kind of pressure as a writer, right? I want to come up to something in the novel that I've been anticipating and dreading at the same time. Anticipating getting there, but dreading whether or not I could pull it off. And that was certainly something that, I mean, that haunted me, especially getting towards the end of the entire series. I mean, there were scenes there that had sat with me for 20 years, and it was very daunting. And there was a worry that I would not be able to pull off what was in my head. And so, but you got to get there to find out, right?
But one of the things I'll say is, like, when you made that decision to have that build up and have the release in that, because you are essentially putting all your eggs in one basket, if that scene doesn't work for a reader, regardless of what you intended, regardless of how because we've gone through it, we've seen the care with which you've constructed it. That doesn't mean it's going to land for everyone.
No.
And it doesn't mean that every reader is going to immediately get what you intended from it. So because all of your eggs are in that basket, like that's an enormous risk, artistic risk to take with a story. But obviously you felt it was worthwhile for those that it did work for because you think it works better.
But yeah, and also it set the precedent because I was going to be doing this for the whole series, right? So, best sort of get the reader sort of on board in some fashion or another, at least in that respect. And then just hope that they would stay patient long enough to get to the end of the 10th book and the last 400 pages or whatever.
Because the point that I wanted to make about contrasting emotions and atonal things and tonal shifts was, while you could balance the tone of the Chain of Dogs with the insert of small scenes of levity or small scenes of relief, what you run the risk of doing with that technique, yes, you're spreading your risk out across the entire narrative. You're far less likely to be reliant on a single scene to please all readers. You balance your risk, but you run the risk then of a totally different thing, which is of reducing the impact of what the Chain of Dogs actually means, of turning it into something that is far more bearable and far less painful, because the reader gets used to, oh, this terrible thing happened, but then this funny thing happened, and then a terrible thing happened, then a funny thing happened. That it lacks the engagement of making the reader emotionally invest in something that is so dark, that is so painful, that is drawn out. And yet, both techniques have their pros and their cons. And even within that, you still have moments of levity, because you have the scene with the cattle dogs and the little lapdog. Like, that's in there. There are these little moments in the Chain of Dogs where you do work in small moments of levity, but you tend to avoid like that big moment.
Yeah, I tend not to involve Coltain. Right, it had to be one moment for Coltain, and that was it.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point. But one of the other risks, one of the things I wanted to talk about was contrasting tones. And we've talked about this on a sentence level, where you can use opposites in sentences, either as floating opposites, or to use one to set apart from another, so that you create contrast to highlight the thing that you're actually focused on. You use its opposite because it casts it in a different light. And obviously you can use tone to do that as well. Having a funny moment can both alleviate darkness, but also can highlight how dark that is, or vice versa. The darkness can make a scene funnier and lighter in contrast. But I think one of the dangers of constantly alternating tone is that it becomes tonally inconsistent, where you don't get a general sense of tone and then the moment of break, and a general sense of tone and a moment of break. If you're constantly going sad, happy, sad, happy, sad, happy, all the way along, it runs the risk of being inconsistent in tone, which can be very jarring as a reader.
Well, yeah, and you've just read Midnight Tide, so think of all the chapters involving Tahol and Bug and even Breeze showing up there, and Shirk, Alal, and all the rest. It's a contained block, right? Which is then contrasted pretty fiercely with the Taisadur side of things. So
they should have been called the Taisadur.
Oh, whatever. So yeah, and again, that's setting up that kind of contrast. But in units that were large enough to be, sort of digested in a single city, if you will, for the chapters anyways.
Yeah. So
what happens is, when you're dealing with those characters, the comedy just slips in, because they are characters who enjoy having a laugh without necessarily laughing out loud. So
yeah, and again, because and this is always a risk in fiction. When you write comedy, if your style of comedy, or the thing that you're trying to make funny, is not the type of funny that reader enjoys, it is going to fall so flat.
Oh yeah.
And that can be absolutely disastrous, particularly when you include say physical comedy and slapstick. A lot of people really enjoy physical comedy and slapstick, and it's hard to do in literature, physical comedy and slapstick. But you do that in quite a few of the Bauchlein and Corval Broach novellas.
And Willful Child as well, yeah.
Yeah. The wordplay and pun humor and that sort of elevated word humor and discourse, that is a totally different style of humor that some people will enjoy and other people won't, because you use those things. And if they are the thing that is providing relief, and the reader doesn't find it funny, that becomes a problem, because you then have people say, well, why did they put that in? Or that's not funny. And you go, well, it's not funny to you. I was laughing my ass off.
Yeah, and I mean, I definitely tried to sort of at least throw in there sort of all those sides, all those types of humor, as many as I can, as I find entertaining. And puns are a very different sort of, they push different buttons than slapstick or toilet humor or whatever. And so quite often, yeah, you end up pushing a lot of buttons and hoping at least one of them works for the reader.
But and again, I think authors are sometimes caught between these two problems where they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't.
Mm-hmm.
If you choose one type of humor, the readers that works for will be the readers that you have. You know, other people will put the book down and they'll never look at it again. And if you use that one type of humor all the way through, you know it's consistently going to land. It's consistently going to land with all of your readers. If you vary your humor, you are encouraging different readers to enjoy it. But you're also increasing the number of people who are not going to enjoy certain sections of it.
Yep. Yep.
So
winning.
So with choosing one type of humor, you limit your readership. By choosing lots of different types of humor, you expand your readership, but you expand the number of people who are going to complain that that scene just wasn't funny.
Yep.
Or why did you include that scene? That's toilet humor. This doesn't match the tone of your work.
Mm.
And that is always going to be an issue because you made that choice to have a variation in style of story you were telling, a variation.
But here's the thing that is often forgotten when it comes to humor, is that you have characters who have a sense of humor, and they have different senses of humor. So what they find amusing and what they engage in is unique to them. And so that's how you can actually employ all different kinds of senses of humor. I mean, to Hole and Bug, there's wordplay running all the way through that, but there's also absurdist humor. That's their shtick, if you will, and that's what amuses and entertains them. And so away you go. Shirka Lal, it's a whole different thing, right? Her sense of humor is, well, it's just different. It has to do with irreverence more than anything else, and maybe some shock value involved, but also quite droll. And so it varies. So characters, you often see that, even like superheroes where they've got their quips and all that kind of stuff, when they've done something, etc. They're all supposed to be straight-faced when they make all these comments. You never see it, a whole bunch of Avengers, one of them say something after a fight and the rest break down laughing. Do we ever see that? Has that ever happened in a film?
I think in some of the superhero deconstruction shows and series where you have characters who are trying out their tagline. They go, oh, I have to come up with my saying. That has been done to death in comedy, making fun of superhero shows or deconstructing superhero shows. I think there have been comedy sketches where someone has made their pun as they're about to do something, and the person they're about to shoot has gone, seriously? Like, yeah, no, and then they enter in, and it's this whole joke about the fact that what they do in superhero films is so patently ridiculous when you look at it through the lens of anything to do with real life.
Yeah, well, I immediately thought Austin Powers and some of the really bad lines that Mike Myers was throwing out, which I thought were hilarious. But just the idea that fictional characters actually can have a sense of humor and express that sense of humor. I don't know if we see it quite often enough in some ways, because a group of your favorite characters on screen all sharing a laugh. I mean, that's an invitation to the audience, isn't it, to share that laugh as well? And it connects on a human level as opposed to simply the superhero, etc. Yeah. I don't know. I think humor is kind of, for a lot of those things, I'm going all the way back to even Indiana Jones, for example, with the sword and the gun in the streets in Cairo. The humor is extracted from the fictional world of that story and delivered to the audience. So the audience is the one that laughs, but nobody in the scene actually seems to acknowledge the humor of that scene, right? So it's as if it's kind of a safe thing to do, to pull it back once, But part of me would really like to see, a lot of it sort of blur that line, so that characters can actually respond the way normal characters would respond to an amusing situation or an amusing scene.
Well, and I think as more sort of postmodern techniques get worked into cinema and narrative, that we are seeing more of that sort of meta evolution, because we're starting to see a lot more deconstruction, say, of superheroes, where those are the jokes that get worked in now. And once the deconstruction of a genre becomes a norm, then that's where you see that become a norm across other forms of storytelling, because the previous genre then becomes very old-fashioned, and it's the deconstruction becomes the new normal, and then from then there's another evolution that we haven't seen yet. But I don't know.
Well, think of I don't know if you've seen all of the original series of Star Trek, but there are moments in there where the characters actually have a good laugh.
Yeah.
And that's really refreshing. And I don't know why it's fallen away out of sort of, I don't know. It's as if everything that we're going to see on screen now is posing. It's all posing. And so there's an element of almost self-conscious, self-control, if you will, that seems to be playing out.
Well, I think maybe with superhero films, it's because they potentially because, and I say potentially, the actors may think, what I am doing is so ridiculous. What I am doing is so silly and over the top. I'm dressed in this costume, and I'm in a room, I'm covered with wires, and the entire room is bright green. There are no other actors here, and someone is holding a stick with a tennis ball on it, which is meant to be my eye line to talk to the make-believe monster that I'm going to act and do my lines to, that because it's become so absurd, that the only way to combat that is to treat it incredibly seriously.
Yeah, straight-faced.
And I think potentially that abstraction where they are locked into CGI generated environments and CGI generated enemies and CGI generated scenes, that so much has been taken away from what humans actually deal with, that it's not like filming on location where people can look at each other and chuckle and laugh. Even when they do blooper reels now, where it shows the actors cracking up at someone fluffing a line. Sometimes those things you go, that actually would have been a better scene than the one that you played, of the guy saying basically the right line and the other, what? And then carrying on with the scene. And the guy just go, oh yeah, right, we know I have to go and kill Uber villain, whoever it is this week. But I do think, as much as CGI has opened the door for amazing vistas and special effects to create things that we never could have put on screen before, there is a downside to it, which is the removal of the immediacy and the authenticity of that experience, which a lot of actors, I think, feed off, because
yes, they do. Yeah.
That's how they're trained. That's how all humans are trained. We feed off the things around us.
Yeah. I mean, I often feel sorry for these actors that have to do this sort of the psychotic expressionless, quasi acting for everything.
Well, I'd feel sorry for them until I think about them, crying themselves to sleep in their $1 million beds, in their multi-million-dollar mansions.
No, that's not what. No, because we're talking about the creative impulse,
I know.
And that needs to be fed. And how many stories and films have we seen about those millionaire actors who are just miserable as all get out, because they've lost, they've been elevated to such a point that they cannot make that connection in some fashion or another as actors, because they're expected to look this way on screen all the time.
And that's why a lot of actors have their passion projects where they go and they make an indie film, or they go and you know, this Hollywood actor, they are on whatever stage doing some play. And it's everyone going, why is that Hollywood actor doing a stage play? They're never going to get paid any kind of money. And you go, well, it's not the money for them anymore.
No.
It's doing something they love, something that's different, something that's giving them that point of connection that they're not getting from these massive behemoth projects.
Yeah.
But, you know, it is, I have to admit, it is sometimes hard to have sympathy for.
I do.
I know, that's because you're much more empathic than I am. I'm a cold, cynical, cruel critic. You're an artist.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But anyway, why don't we finish up here for the night, Steve?
All right. It must be late over there.
So thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time once again to go through this. I know we had some technical difficulties with my internet connection. I will try to smooth those out.
Cool.
So thank you very much. And thank you very much for watching. And we will see you in the next one.